frickin' do this. The magic here. So big. I guess that's just the way it's gonna be. All right. Okay. So we are live. Wanted to talk about this paper. Let me do one last push. Copy. Not there. All right. Let's do this thing. Okay, so I wanted to talk about this Monica, I'm going to get her name wrong, aren't I? Kaminska paper. And you can get it right from The Hague, or not The Hague, right from here. This is the little spotty spot you can get it. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what it says and what we can look at from judging its sort of value. I don't know. What does it mean? What does it all mean? What does life mean? So first thing I want to do is say, what is the question it is trying to answer? And the question is, what conditions might escalation happen? Why is this paper important? That's kind of what I'm trying to ask. Why haven't earlier cases of CNA, in this case, resulted in escalation? Why are the disconnects in policy and tech so painful? So that's kind of the broader question it's trying to answer. This here is a counter battery radar, right? So how come when, the U.S. gets cyber attacked, how come we're not cyber attacking back? And if we look at the paper, she's very explicit that she does not really mean the CNE style exploits. She really does mean CNA, which I thought was really good. So if we scroll on over here, she does have a degrade, deny style in here, right? So she's we're explicitly talking about CNA. Disrupt, degrade, deny, destroy, or influence. She's adding influence to this because it's cool. It just throws more data in there. So that was that's something that you should point out in your own head is when she talks about cyber attack, why did she add influence? And I'll get to that in the weaknesses portion of this. But okay, so that's what she's saying. Why is it that the United States does not seem to respond, effectively to this stuff? So if I want to sum up kind of the conclusion, I would say, and I stole this from JD Work, he said, risk aversion drives an overreaction to uncertainty, which emphasizes dynamics like escalation in policy thinking in ways that restrain your response and they counter your options, right? So he's what would be a much longer way to say we're always tied up in red tape? Why did we create that red tape? So that's kind of if we had to talk about the overall themes. And one of the problems I have with papers is they are very political, right? So you as a reader often have some skin in the game in a lot of different ways, and you may feel that the conclusion is right, and therefore you may be predisposed to believe the paper is also correct. But a conclusion can be correct without a paper being correct. And that's a very difficult thing to get over mentally. So I cut this out because I really thought another red flag to me here was the idea when people say persistent engagement and defend forward always together. When they say that always together. It makes me think they think they're all the same thing. But I really do think these are kind of separate and should be thought of separately in the sense that, as far as I can tell, persistent engagement is essentially a model of the world. It's a way of understanding what you're seeing all around you in cyber, as opposed to defend forward, which is a strategy for dealing with your opponents. So that's, and people, I think, get defend forward a little bit wacky as well. It doesn't necessarily always mean hacking the hackers. Anyway, so that was something that I thought was very weird in this sense. And here what she's trying to say, and this is actually her CFR.org article. She's trying to say, you may think that defend forward is in fact very aggressive, but it realistically is a risk. It's like a risk mitigation strategy instead. So that's an interesting way to put it. This is the conclusion of her CFR piece, and she says, it could be the case that deterrence strategies are simply incompatible with Western risk dispositions towards retaliation. And I think the funny thing about this is that maybe that's true, but most people talking about persistent engagement are actually talking about it in a way that contrasts with a deterrent strategy. So if you read Emily Goldman's paper that came out recently on a paradigm shift with persistent engagement, it's sort of like deterrence was the old and busted, and persistent engagement is the new hotness. So that something here was, I think, I felt like she was out of the stream of current thought when I started reading that. Okay, so this is a little piece of the paper that I just, threw in little pieces of the paper that I was starting to read. So she's saying, look, actually, I don't even know if I want to get to this part of the paper right now, but she's saying the United States is a risk-averse nation. Therefore, instead of doing counter cyber attacks or counter actions, which could include anything after a cyber attack, they're going to be doing risk management, which is preventative action, increased resilience, and consequence management. So that's the theory of the paper, right? So if we want to sort of develop a theory of the paper, what are the restrained responses? The responses are either mixed with other efforts or just generally worthless, just sort of like, nothing much was happening with the responses, right? And so she has some interviews with Obama people especially who are like, yeah, I just, we did something, but it wasn't really much, right? So I think that's the argument for restrained responses. I think that's one of the easier arguments to make, although, and we will get into some weaknesses with that as well. All right, so risk aversion versus proportional response. So if you do international relations or you're a fan of the West Wing, you no doubt have seen the scene where the president is like, what is the value of proportional response? And the response from his NSC is proportional response is what there is. It doesn't empty the bucket for later. It doesn't make it so that you're acting like a crazy person on the international stage. It is the only option for a mature, powerful country. And she gives as the only counterexample to what a risk society would be. It's one of the weak, the more you read the paper, honestly, I wanted to really love this paper. But the more I read the paper, it felt weaker and weaker over time. And she really only gives one counterexample in terms of what a risk society would be. And her counterexample is Iran. So she says, Iran has been conducting destructive cyber attacks in response to other cyber attacks, right? So that's a counterexample. What are the other reasons, you would ask yourself as you're reading, that Iran might have chosen to use cyber and not have done sanctions, military attacks, other diplomatic forms of deterrence, sent nasty letters or whatever it is? And I think you cannot say that Iran is a risk-prone society if this is their only option, for example, right? So the case she did not make in this paper is Iran chose to use cyber as a counterexample because in some way it was linked to their ability to absorb risk as a general society. And so I think that really does, it's not a great part of the paper, right? So the other thing about another thing that you'll notice in the paper is that she says, we can identify the three main practices that risk societies are likely to carry out, right? She returns to this thing: preventative action, increasing resilience, and consequence management. So the problem with this part of the paper is that you're going to see those three things no matter what. Like, no matter what, the United States has to do that. So if you're building a scientific testable hypothesis, you would want something where some societies would be doing increasing resilience and other societies wouldn't in a measurable way. It's not focused enough to be testable. So I think that's one of the other major weaknesses of this paper. It's just lack of scientific precision, essentially. So that's sort of the general arguments of the paper. I've already gotten into some of the weaknesses. And I'm gonna dive deeper down. If the author is in fact on the live stream, I guess I will be as nice as possible. And this is just it's just normal part of life. Actually, I found that authors kind of love this stuff, to be fair, because it means someone really read their paper and not like just read it like briefly, but actually read it. So it's not usually a problem. Anyway, so one thing I found in all of these papers that you're going to see is this concept of proliferation, because proliferation is it's like a hot point for anyone in international relations. They just love the idea of talking about proliferation. It's just like, it's amazing. But the problem is that it's really hard to talk about with cyber. There's some things in the paper that really misunderstand a lot of this stuff. But in general, like this, I actually cut out a little piece of this because it was so wacky. One thing you'll see is like this idea that adversaries need to draw inspiration from the operations that they catch or that they read about on Kaspersky pages. And there's just like, I've been an adversary and I've talked to a bunch of adversaries, and they, in rare cases do you get inspiration and that you reuse from some other actor. It's just ridiculous. So everyone in international relations journals needs to stop talking about that. Or authors of all types, we'll just say. But the other side of the fact is like there actually are a lot more counterexamples to the likelihood of proliferation of cyber capabilities than examples in the CNA space. And that's something we'll get into later. It's kind of weirdly counterintuitive. Preemption is therefore not a viable strategy. I don't know. Some of this stuff, I would just say like the accuracy level of this section of the paper was not. I didn't think it was great. So in the cyber domain where signaling is impaired, people say that as if it's like a fact, right? Fact, you can't signal. But if you look at some of the I think one of the better CNA operations would have been North Korea against Sony Pictures. And that signaling was pretty darn clear. So, and much of a better example. So let's go into some more of the other things that I just thought, okay, so this in general, all right, this is, look, it's not, I get it when you have like a tool like sociology and you're like, I want to apply sociology to like, how do I predict what happens in the cyber domain and cyber policy and cybersecurity? There's probably ways to do that, but I do not think this idea that some societies are risk societies and other societies are not is at the right level of abstraction, right? So she sort of says the United States and UK is a risk society, therefore a bunch of other stuff follows. That's just not how this stuff works, if you think about it, right? Like, we often feel certain things are more risky than other things. We may have a different profile for how we view different risks. We may think cyber is extremely risky without thinking that, say, gun violence is that risky at all, right? So there's like fissures even in that level of abstraction of what the generalized risk of a society is. This part of the paper, the central thesis here is very weak. And this just shows you an example of that weakness. Like, I like both Sarah Krebs and Jackie Schneider, but survey studies should never be used in science, essentially, ever. They're just not like this. It's very rare you're going to get value by using a survey study. But in general, like, we're going to survey the U.S. domestic public and find out what they think about restraint in response to cyber attacks. Like, are we going to explain the escalatory ladder to the general public in a survey? I have a feeling that they wanted to use an elevator. You know what I mean? Like, they did not know what you were talking about here. And if they did know, I don't think they are the people to ask. So, like, you know, the people, maybe if you did a very focused survey on a very focused audience, like inside Cybercom, maybe, right? So, or maybe inside the NSC. This part it's not good. It's not good to try to use this to support an argument. And again, the data size of the paper is very small. And I understand that not all papers have to have like a big spreadsheet or database behind them. Like, some of them you make an argument and the argument is like one thing. Like, you have one data point. And you're like, this is what I think I see. It's cool. But the data size here is three things, right? So WannaCry, NotPetya, and the 2016 election interference, which is why she added interference to the CNA, like traditional D4 stuff, right? So it's not a very big data set. I would say it's possible that we don't respond to these three things effectively for three completely different reasons. So I think it would have been valuable to go over a much bigger data set of these things. And then let's talk a little bit about this. This statement, it's just like the interconnectedness of systems in the cyber domain means there's a high degree of probability that malware would end up spreading outside its intended target. I don't know that that's true. I don't. I think what people think that's true because Stuxnet was detected at a certain point. But there might be other reasons for that. And so if this is the case, the operation is likely picked up by threat intelligence companies. Maybe not. That's a whole separate, there's a whole bunch. That's a whole nother paper. This is where you'd be like, citation needed. But actually, I don't think even a citation would help you. I just don't think it's necessarily accurate, right? So it's possible that U.S. responses to cyber incidents have been covert and have been effective, right? So in that case, we may have also responded to WannaCry or NotPetya covertly and effectively, and just it may not be public. That's just a problem we have in this cyber policy sphere, right? So, okay, so here's a problem I often have with these papers is if you're going to do this kind of analysis correctly, you need to look at who they are quoting and what they are saying. And this is sort of like a recursive problem. So if I actually talk to Langer and I ask him, were the techniques in Stuxnet generic enough to be used against other targets, he would give me a pretty subtle answer, right? Like, because the answer is not yes or no. The answer is the idea that you could utilize, SCADA systems to do bad things was not new. Stuxnet did it well. Maybe that was interesting. How to hide this stuff was interesting, but obviously that's not going to port over to other versions typically. So here again, we're going to get into this inspiration question, and it's just not, these things are not, I would not say they're accurate, is I guess where I'm going with that. I would not say they're accurate, and I would not say that they're supported by the actual citation, which is more dangerous. And what you'll find often in cyber policy papers is what they are saying is not correctly supported by the citations. So if you go read the citations, she might argue this one, but I would not say that one's accurate in general. So the paper is very interesting. In that it makes this Obama to Trump cyber comparison, and I don't know that it necessarily has to. So It's sort of like, I think it's a separate paper that it really should have been, and it's sort of interesting, but it's not. It doesn't have to do that. So the questions I try to ask myself are, when I'm reading a paper like this, are what predictions does this paper make that I would not, without this analysis, be able to make? Are those predictions testable? Are they something that I could see near enough time, or that there wouldn't be enough confounding factors that I could understand that, in fact, the analysis within the paper was perhaps an element of the cause? And then what are the alternative hypotheses to what the paper is trying to portray? So, for example, are there other hypotheses that, like, we did not respond effectively to WannaCry because WannaCry was North Korea. North Korea is already under all of the sanctions it can be under right now, right? So what is our response supposed to be? Are we supposed to go to war over WannaCry? And the same thing's true with NotPetya and at some level the election interference, right? So there are other constraints upon our actions that are not us being risk averse. And because we have such a limited data set cited in this paper, it's hard to say that the paper actually is supported by its own arguments. And that's pretty much, I mean, we can go over the details of the paper. I think I guess that's what I would go with, is the conclusion might be correct. We might have too much restraint because we are averse to particular risks. But I don't think this paper conclusively demonstrates that. And I think it's very useful to read as an example of the kind of paper you'll see in this space that might make all these mistakes, right? So you're going to see these arguments again and again and again and again. They're similar. So that's what I've got. I mean, you're going to see this you see references to Eternal Blue over and over as being repurposed after having been leaked. That's the result of hostile intel action, and I don't think, and so it's sort of like we make all of our arguments off of anomalies. That's just the summary of I think one of the weaknesses we have as a society in this world, trying to make sense of this stuff. So that's that. I think you should read the paper, but I would say take some of these thoughts in mind when you do. And that's kind of the end of my thoughts on this paper. So thanks for joining. Bye.